Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today we are going to hear about the book Intercourse by Andrea Dworkin, and Helen Pringle is going to discuss it for us. So thank you so much, Helen, and over to you.
Thanks, Jo. I'm going to be talking about Andrea Dworkin's Intercourse. First of all, I'm speaking from Gadigal land in Australia, and I'm very happy to be here. And I'm filling in for somebody who was unable to come, so that's why I hope you don't get too sick of me to see me and so recently before that. So this is about Andrea Dworkin's Intercourse, which was published in 1987. I've just cited a website where you can read the book online, and there's a number of places. If you can't find it there, just Google Intercourse and PDF or something, and you'll find a copy there. So I hope you're able to follow. And I've also printed up also cited the contents page, and you can see that the book, this is from the latest, the reissue of the book for the 20th anniversary of the publication of the book from 1987. And you can see how the chapters have these wonderful titles: Repulsion, Skinless, Stigma, Communion, which is my favorite chapter of the book. And it's structured as an engagement, I suppose, with a number of writers, male writers, but throughout engaging with them in order to make an argument. And what the argument is about intercourse, as you can see. And I don't know if you're aware, but intercourse I think is a fairly old-fashioned type of English word. My parents, instead of saying sex, they would say intercourse. Have you had intercourse? Or a doctor would always say to you when he examined you for various things, for various what we call female problems. He would always say to you, when did you last have intercourse? But it's a great word, I think, and it has that sense also of the relations between people, how they're conducted, and how what they mean and what their significance is, and how they might be when we understand ourselves, when we know ourselves. So the first thing that I'm just going to do is just read a little passage from Andrea Dworkin, and I've got the subtitles up on the slide so you can follow me if you can't follow what I'm saying. I'll just sit a little bit closer so I speak more loudly, and I'll get Jo to turn the first slide on here. So it's rather long. I'm just going to read the first part, but just as a way of into the book. So Andrea Dworkin says, being owned and being fucked. And I must say, I have to warn you have to signal to you rather, that there's a lot of, that Andrea Dworkin tends to use the word fuck quite a bit in the passages and in the book. And there's a question about what she means by that, but I think the meaning becomes clear from the context in which she's using it, just like the meaning of intercourse becomes clear from the context in which she uses it at a particular time. So she says, being owned and being fucked are or have been virtually synonymous experiences in the life of women, the lives of women. He owns you, he fucks you. The fucking conveys the quality of the ownership. He owns you inside out. The fucking conveys the passion of dominance. It requires access to every hidden inch. He can own everything about you and everything on you and everything you are capable of doing as a working servant, as a worker, servant, or ornament. But getting inside you and owning your insides is possession, deeper, more intimate than any other kind of ownership, even slavery. Intimate, raw, total. The experience of sexual possession for women is real and literal, without any magical or mystical dimension to it. Getting fucked and being owned are inseparably the same. Together, being one and the same, they are sex for women under male dominance as a social system. In the fuck, the man expresses the geography of his dominance. Her sex, her insides, are part of his domain as a male. She talks about this experience of being possessed, and the experience of being possessed I think in a way that has resonances with the way that we often talk about being possessed or haunted. Somebody that we are not. Somebody is speaking through us. Somebody that we are not is the person that is being that is on show and that is being heard. She then goes on to say, he can possess her as an individual, be her lord or master, and thus be expressing a private right of ownership, the private right issuing from his gender, or he can possess her by fucking her impersonally and thus be expressing a collective right of ownership without masquerade or manners. Most women are are not distinct private individuals to most men, and so the fuck tends towards a clear assertion of dominance. Women live inside this reality of being owned and being fucked. They are sensate inside it. The body learning to respond to what male dominance offers as touch, as sex, as love. When I read these passages now, I often think of that saying by some trans persons, some men identifying as trans, who say that they are better women than us. And I once was trying to work out what they meant by that. And I forget who I was having a conversation with. I suspect it was Sheila, but it might not have been. The person said to me, well, of course, they're better women than us because they have created us. They know what we are. They made us. We are their fantasy. So that's what they know. And they know that better than we do. We're still struggling to understand what that means. She then goes on to say in the next slide, just quickly, she says, this is this reality of being owned. Oh, Jo, can I get you to go to the next one? This reality of being, oh, that's skipped one, I think. I'll read it anyway. Sorry, I've left it out. She says, this reality of being owned and being fucked as experience, a social, political, economic and psychological unity frames, limits, sets parameters for what women feel and experience in sex. Being a person who is owned and fucked means becoming someone who experiences sensuality in being possessed, in the touch of the possessor in his fuck, however callous it is to the complexity or the subtlety of one's own humanity. Because a woman's capacity to feel sexual pleasure is developed within the narrow confines of male sexual dominance, internally there is no separate being, conceived, nurtured somewhere else under different material circumstances, screaming to get out. We are not being repressed. In other words, we are made. What we are is what we are made. There's nothing below that on which that experience is placed in the way that slavery is, for example, placed on a pre-existing reality. She says there is only the blood and flesh and blood reality of being a sensate being whose body experiences sexual intensity, sexual pleasure, and sexual identity in being possessed, in being owned and fucked. There's a very simple answer to this and a very simple kind of response to it, I think, which is to say, that's not me. And I think a lot of the rest of the book is about why that is me, how that is me, and how to know myself is to know that that is me. This is central to her understanding of objectification, of the notion of objectification. For Andrea Dworkin, objectification is fundamental in thinking through questions about who I am and about who you are and who we are as persons or as women, which means as other and less than persons. Objectification for her involves being defined in terms of your sexual use and being used in that way. At the heart of objectification is the fuck. The violence of this word and the repetition of this word in her work reflects how objectification works, as probably, she says, the most singly destructive aspect of gender hierarchy, especially as it exists in relation to intercourse. So Dworkin argues that understanding the fuck is a central task, if not the central task, of a feminist account of justice. That's giving to others what is their due as humans. In our world, it's now often assumed, the world that we live in, it's now often assumed that having more intercourse is a sign of greater freedom, of sexual liberation and pleasure. The more you have, the more free you are, the more liberated you are. For Dworkin, however, more fucking is not the path to greater freedom, at least not for women. She argues that gender is not simply difference between men and women, but that it's a relation of domination and subordination. This is sort of familiar ground for us, I think. That relation of domination and subordination marks out women as what can be sexually used and abused. Marks out women as when they can be fuckable, when they can't be, who can, who can't, circumstances under which they can be used and abused sexually. So what she does here is to go way beyond saying that those who have economic and political power are more likely to be men, and that power has been biased to uphold men's status. She makes the claim that power in its very form is exercised as male power. The very language of identity and knowledge and justice is that of male sexuality, in which women appear as objects for use. So what she wants to say is that male language is the only tongue there is. There is no other. And I'll just, the next slide, if I could, from Jo. There. She says, we know only this one language of these folks who enter and occupy us men. They keep telling us that we're different from them, yet we speak only their language and have none or none that we remember of our own. And we don't dare, it seems, invent one of our own, even in signs and our gestures. Our bodies speak their language. Our minds think in it. The men are inside us through and through. We hear something sometimes, a dim whisper, barely audible, somewhere at the back of the brain. There's some other word, and we think, some of us think, sometimes we think that once it belonged to us, that we had that word. So how we speak and how we see and what we do, all of these things work themselves out in male terms. So objectification is not something that's imposed on us, that we pre-existing women are not made into objects, but objectification is a form of cognition. It's a form of knowledge of ourselves through which we come to know ourselves as the things called women. The crucial point here is not only for Dworkin, is not only in the book that not only that sexual difference is constructed rather than natural, although it is, and not only that sexual difference is constructed in male terms, although it is as well. Sexual difference takes shape in terms of domination and subordination, in terms of a hierarchy that is erotic, that somebody somewhere is getting off on, and it's not only men. Through the making of women as objects, men are aroused to dominance across a wide field. To slightly misuse a phrase of Catherine McCann's, I fuck, therefore I am, for men. For Dworkin's feminism, this objectification of women is not primarily accomplished as repression acting on some pre-existing freedom or space or body. The construction of us as women involves making us into the possessed, into making us accomplices in oppression. We speak their language. We have none of our own, such that the harm that's thereby created in the making of us as women, becomes invisible, or at least unclear, mystified even, because objectification is what constitutes us as women. And we're rewarded for doing this, not only for submitting to this, but for doing it to ourselves, for shaping and presenting ourselves in certain ways, in our body, in our clothes, in our appearance, everything about us. This harm of objectification is so difficult to see because it's primarily accomplished exactly through sex itself. So the detriment or the harm to women at issue here is sex, which, as Dworkin points out, everybody wants more of. Well, they want to get much more of the time. She says, in America, spelt with a K, because that's how she spelt America. In America, there is the nearly universal conviction that sex, fucking in brackets, is good, and that liking it is right, morally right. It is a sign of human health, nearly a standard for citizenship. So she says, in this context, our allegiance to sex, to fucking, to intercourse, is like a loyalty oath. We take this oath, you know, my oath, I swear to sex that I will praise it and try to get as much of it as I possibly can. That dissent and ambivalence are not permitted. If you start to say that you don't take this loyalty oath to sex, or that you don't think that more sex is a sign of freedom or liberation, then people call you all sorts of names. I'm sure you're familiar with them. I don't know what they are in Spanish or in other words, but things like prude, hate sex, dried up old bone, old. We're generally called old when women don't like sex anymore in that way. So this loyalty oath to more sex as liberation fails to understand how intercourse works as a performance of domination and as a dramatization of subordination, our subordination, women's subordination. In intercourse, what Dworkin does is to analyze the making of men and women in the acts and institutions of sex through an exploration of various literary works that I mentioned before. For her, pornography is obviously at the heart of how objectification works as domination. We live in a pornographic society and culture, absolutely saturated in it, not only in the sense that men's pornographic objects exist, like their sex dolls, their photos, their videos, etc. Not only that they exist, or that they reflect an unequal treatment of women elsewhere, which they do. But Dworkin argues that pornography is the treatment of women. It's not a reflection of the treatment of women, and it's not a harmless fantasy, obviously. She doesn't understand pornography along the model of contagion, you know, which is that kind of model where the man reads rape in a pornographic object or sees rape in a pornographic object, then rapes woman after he's done that. In fact, in my own work, I've been studying a lot of cases where it seems like pornography never stops. When in a number of fairly prominent murder cases in New Zealand and Australia, which is the ones that I've focused on, there are examples of men who consume pornography before an act of sexual assault and murder, consume pornography during it, and they also produce pornography during it by taking a video of themselves doing it. And then the first thing that they do after they've committed a murder is to go and consume some more pornography. It's just, there's no kind of boundary between pornography and the world anymore. It is a pornographic world in that way. She doesn't understand pornography as in that sort of causal way that you see and then you do, but she says pornography, and that's often summed up by saying pornography, she says, instead of the phrase, she says pornography is the theory and pornography is the practice. So it's not pornography is the theory and rape is the practice. Pornography is the theory, pornography is the practice. I don't know if you've missed something, Jane. So she says pornography runs a masquerade that it's about the appreciation of women and about setting them free, but for Dworkin, it's a modality of the fuck as sexual possession. By possession is meant here not only abuse through rape, but the way in which the normal fuck by a normal man is taken to be an active invasion and ownership undertaken in a mode of predatoriness or predation. Being taken possession of in this way is for women a normal everyday reality. She says, women feel the fuck when it works, when it overwhelms as possession, and they feel that possession as deeply erotic and value annihilation of the self in sex as proof of the man's desire or love. Being possessed is real for women, and sex itself is an experience of diminishing self-possession and erosion of self. That loss of self is a physical reality, not just a psychic kind of vampirism. And as a physical reality, it's chilling and extreme, a literal erosion of the body's integrity and its ability to function and to survive. So she's saying that objectification here, our objectification by men, is not just erotic to men, but they create us as erotic accomplices, if you like, as being complicit in our own objectification, in our own subjection. Women's complicity in the fuck of possession is not natural or biological. It doesn't have to be that way. It's born simply from our desire to live in this world that we didn't make and a language that we don't speak. Complicity is a survival mechanism that proceeds to a more complete annihilation of the self, but it's always masked. It always comes masked to us as the giving and sometimes the experience of pleasure, of intense pleasure. So the idea here is that in order to live, women not merely submit to men as slaves might do, but they transform, let me put it in another way, we transform ourselves into an object to be desired. We construct ourselves as a beautiful and fuckable thing in a very physical sense. And so this is the terrible damage done through collaboration in women's possession as objects, confirmed in the act of fucking itself. I want to just deal in a minute, and maybe at the end as well, with this question of whether Dworkin is blaming the victim. I don't think there's any, I can say with certainty that that's not her intent, but sometimes people slip into ways of talking that are not their intent. And so it's a good question about whether in some sense she's blaming us for what we have become. But I think it's a little bit more, I don't think it quite works like that as a victim blaming. So how we become objects is in our collaboration in sex itself, in the act of fucking itself. She says it's especially in the acceptance of object status that her humanity, women's humanity, is hurt. It's a metaphysical acceptance of lower status in sex and in society, an implicit acceptance of less freedom, less privacy, less integrity. In becoming an object so that he can objectify her, so that he can fuck her, she begins a political collaboration with his dominance. And then when he enters her, he confirms for himself and for what she is that she is something, not someone, certainly not someone equal. So from complicity through, I can answer that question about Stoltenberg, but maybe somebody else can do it in the questions. From complicity through to collaboration, women become objects that are not human in any sense related to freedom or justice. Our identity is thereby estranged from personhood and from the freedom that persons have and characteristic of persons. As complicit objects, women are these so-called persons in human form, but even that, not exactly. Things who can't remember or manifest the physical reality of freedom, who do not seem to want or to value the individual experience of freedom. An incalculable injustice is done, every bit as material and as real as oppression at work. Dworkin's argument in regard to the fuck of possession rests on seeing violence of subordination as intimately connected to sexual pleasure. She thereby challenges the making in our world, which is the only one that we have, of any clear distinction between sex and violence. So, it's very common to say that rape is violence, not sex, but that doesn't make sense. We know that sex and violence are intricately connected, and so violence is not what makes something rape. It's a bit more complicated than that about the question. It's not just the presence of violence that distinguishes rape from sex. Dworkin takes seriously the notion that we are constructed, and she presents a very non-biological theory of what it means to be man or woman. And here I have a lot of troubles with this because I'm grappling, like a lot of people are at the moment, I think, or trying to think through the question of our bodies and how our bodies are related to, and it's a question which has been precipitated by the rise of the trans rights movement, is to try to think of how our bodies are related and what importance they have in terms of our status and in terms of the predatory moves that are being made on what little status that we have. But also, she says, male power is not biological. It's not a power that's externally imposed on us, even though it's encompassing and successful. So encompassing and successful that it's easy for women to say and for men to say, well, that's just how the world is. That's how we are. the system, in other words, the system of patriarchy that's built up here has a totality that other systems of oppression don't have. And the question then becomes, well, what could freedom even mean for us? What could it mean for us to be free? For the possessed, for the haunted, those who are owned and fucked. Dworkin writes, the political meaning of intercourse for women is the fundamental question of feminism freedom. Can an occupied people, that's us, physically occupied inside, internally invaded, can we be free? Can those with a metaphysically compromised privacy have self-determination? Can those without the biologically based physical integrity have self-respect? Or how could we gain freedom where our very bodies are shaped by the complicity that begins in the destruction of self-respect, the capacity for self-determination and freedom, by which our bodies are readied for the fuck rather than for freedom, that we make little girls into creatures who will be able to participate in this fuck economy rather than to be free in the world. According to Dworkin, a theory of sexuality is feminist in that it treats sexuality as a social construct of male power. Women are not excluded from the male defined world. We aren't off somewhere else excluded from it. We are in it. We're incorporated into it as its targets and its victims, but even more so as its accomplices. In this world, women are not autonomous, but are embodiments of male power. And then that's the corollary to that statement, before I fuck, therefore I am. For a woman, you would say instead, I'm fucked. Therefore I am an object. The unfreedom of women differs significantly from other forms of unfreedom because it involves complicity, and moreover, a complicity in pleasure. Oppression in this system, in our system, takes the space and name of freedom by positioning women to initiate their own destruction. And it's the next passage where Dworkin says, whatever intercourse is, it's not freedom. And if it can't exist without objectification, it never will be. Instead, occupied women will be collaborators, more base, more lowly in their collaboration than other collaborators have ever been. We experience pleasure in our own inferiority. We call intercourse freedom. This is a tragedy beyond the power of language to convey, and what has been imposed on women by force becomes a standard of freedom for women, and all the women say it's so, that we transform our unfreedom into some idea. And you can see this very clearly in the way that, what's it called, that sort of, I don't know, maybe it's called Fuck Me Freedom or something, where I know there's a word for it, and it's not coming to me at the moment, where women talk about their empowerment by their the strength and frequency with which they act like men in their sexual lives. That sort of swaggering kind of style that men have. The political face of this or the political dilemma of this system, which is constructed in this way, poses the question to feminism of who it's possible to be and how you can live in a culture, how we can live in a culture that tortures women into shape like this. If you're created as an object, if I am created as an object, if I take form as a woman through objectification, how can I possibly speak from the position of subject as anything other than object? But for Dworkin, feminism as a movement confronts the very impossibility of being human for the thing called women or woman. The political face of this impossibility is the apparent consent of many women to practices built on objectification. Women's consent to forceful sex, women's consent in prostitution, in the prostitution system, women's consent in the making and use of pornography, women's consent in a whole range of practices. I think Sheila was just mentioning about high heels, and I often think of those shoes, which are kind of, which we don't even recognize as like bound feet, we sort of look down on bound feet, rightly so. as torturing women into a certain shape, but we think of high heels, which construct our feet in similar ways, make us move in certain ways or not move in other ways, in other certain ways. We think of them as glamour rather than as constriction and torture. Dworkin points to a whole series or a whole range of things where women do consent to things that look like things that look like and are objectification. That consent, when she points to that consent, and when other people, let me say, whenever other people point to that consent, they often use that, say in the prostitution system, they use that as a point against feminism. So they say, but women consent to prostitution. But women consent to sadomasochism. But women love high heel shoes, etc. And that way. But this consent is not a point against Dworkin's analysis or anything that we might say either. Acknowledging, but it is important to acknowledge that women's consent and how it works, that women do consent and how it works, that's integral to an analysis of how male power exercises itself through the distribution of pleasure. That pain is inflicted on us, but also pleasure is elicited from us. And that's one of the most insidious parts of this horrific system as well, that it works through our pleasure, not merely through our pain. Pornography holds a privileged place in the pleasure, in this economy or this geography of pleasure. That is pornography as sex. Like I mentioned before, pornography which creates the object woman and whose possession and use is sex in the male system. Pornography invents women in the way that it invests power in men. You know, there's that old English word investiture. Like I think Charles III, whatever he's called, the king was invested, the investiture. The power is invested in him. It's a strange kind of thing when you think about it for more than 1 second. Pornography invents women in its investiture of power in men. Pornography doesn't stand against or outside law. It's not an outlaw practice, but is central in the law of sexual dominance, whose purpose is to promote the power of men over women and to keep women sexually subjugated, which means accessible to men. Doesn't mean that they want access 24/7, but it means that they want to be guaranteed that access 24/7, so that when they feel like it, that's what they have their little entitlement card for. The central principle of the law of dominance is the creation of women as less human and less free than men. So we live in a pornographic world, according to Dworkin, in which pornography is the public face of male social order. It's not private, illicit entertainment. And again, this strikes me as going so much against the grain of pornography is always talked about whether it's a private practice and whether a man has the right, under form of its consideration in the United States court system for a long time, has taken the form of whether a man has the right to read, which sounds so old-fashioned nowadays, used to be read, but now consume pornography in the privacy of his own home. In other words, that as long as it's a private practice, well, maybe that's all right. But she regards pornography as the public face of male social order. It's not private in any significant sense. That's really, I think, the basis of her analysis in terms of possession and intercourse. But I do want to finish on a different note, and because it's the note that she finishes on as well. She talks about what can we do if this is the case, if this is what our world is, our language is. It's about who we are and how men are. What can we do? And if I could put it in this way, how can the objects be free? That's us. How can the objects even speak as themselves and in their own voice? You'll probably know one of Dworkin's most innovative proposals with Catherine McKinnon was to approach pornography as a civil rights violation, sort of analogous to racial discrimination, say, which would allow those hurt by pornographic subordination to speak of their detriment or harm, and to claim damages. The proposal used the definition, pornography is the graphic, sexually explicit subordination of women. And I think the word that's really important there in that little phrase is. Pornography is the graphic, sexually explicit subordination of women. It doesn't reflect the subordination. It doesn't cause a subordination. It is. It does reflect and it does cause as well, but fundamentally it is subordination. So it's not just a matter of certain pornographic objects like books in the past, books and magazines, or videos now, but a whole set of practices and industry as well, as Gail Dines made clear in her book. For Dworkin and McKinnon, after hearings that gathered evidence from experts and from women and men who'd been harmed, who claimed their lives had been wounded by pornography, Dworkin and McKinnon proposed amending US city ordinances in line with this view that pornography is a practice of civil inequality on the basis of gender. As part of the law of the social order, of the sexual and social order, pornography delineates also or stipulates who is fuckable and how. This whole law of who and how changed radically in the 1960s and 1970s, on what my parents called the sexual revolution. But Dworkin warned that a generalization of access to fucking did not herald a new era of freedom for women. Her suspicion of the liberating power of normal sex was viewed by some of her critics as opposition to sex itself. It was once a common slur that Dworkin had said that all sex is rape. She never says that anywhere in her work. However, I think that she did argue, there is a sense in which there's a truth to that, hiding in that phrase that all sex is rape. She did argue that it's often difficult to distinguish sex from rape in the system of subordination that passes as pleasure, where rape resembles what passes for the normal sex by which men assert possession of women. So speaking of Stanley Kowalski, in A Streetcar Named Desire, the film and the book and the play, Dworkin writes that it takes a human consciousness, including a capacity for suffering, to distinguish between a rape and a fuck. With no interior life of human meaning and human remorse, any fuck is simply expressive and animalistic, whatever the consequences or circumstances. However, Dworkin conveyed with characteristic humour. I think it's often forgotten that she was a very good-humoured person and had a very sharp and sarcastic wit. She said that she did have confidence that there is indeed somewhere a difference to be discerned between sex and rape. And she said, I think both sexual pleasure and intercourse can and will survive equality. I'm not sure about that. There seems to be a massive propaganda campaign being waged that equality is a eros killer. That this kind of renewed defense of the position that in order to be erotic, sex must be unequal in some ways. Dworkin sees sexual subordination as a question about injustice, of how some people live and breathe at the expense of others. Women don't live in this order or in this world. That's our world. And that's rightly and justly and urgently our aim, to live well, to live well and to flourish. When our pleasure is a complicity or a stake in our own subordination, we're not living. Our life is not our own. And to become a woman in the form of an image of male pleasure is to live out an injustice, to live your life as a reflection of male power, as a creature of male power, as a construction of male power. What kind of life is that? For Dworkin, we commonly identify what we see as sex in this world with what sex could be in another world. We identify with what we have to settle for as sex and as passion. But fucking, she says, could be more. It could be redemption in and of the world, as Dworkin writes in discussing the writer James Baldwin. She says, in fucking, and here she's talking about what could be, one's insides are on the line. I have difficulty in reading this passage. I find it immensely moving. She says, our insides are on the line, and the fragile and unique intimacy of going for broke makes communion possible in human reach, not transcendental and otherworldly, but an experience in flesh of love. Those broken too much by the world's disdain could become for each other the dwelling place that each had despaired of finding. She uses the work of James Baldwin, a novel of James Baldwin, Another Country, to put forward the view that sex promises something else than what we get, that it promises us an astonishing grace. She says, it promises us the possibility of being known, being seen and known in all one's awful trouble and shabby dignity, having a witness to what one is and why. It offers us an astonishing grace, although often pushed back by our fear itself, our fear of how we could live and how we could be with others. She says, with this grace, fucking can be communion, a sharing mutual possession of an enormous mystery. It has there the intensity and magnificence of violent feeling transformed into tenderness. I think tenderness has tended to fall out of the vocabulary of male sexual pleasure, if it ever was there. In Intercourse and her other work, Dworkin offers a morality of sex against its corruption in a pornographic world or in a rape culture that's tainted by cheap propagandistic views of fucking. So she didn't see more of it, more fucking, as the benchmark of women's freedom. She knew from her own life and experience that trying to imagine a sex of mutuality between equals could earn for a woman very easily the name of an enemy of sex or prude. Dworkin suggests that critiques of rape, pornography, and prostitution are labelled sex negative, that familiar dismissive term that we get. She says, if you critique rape, pornography, and prostitution, you're labelled sex negative. Perhaps, she says, this is so because so many men use these ignoble methods of access and domination to get laid, and without these ways of getting laid, the number of fucks would so significantly decrease that men might nearly be chaste. CHASTE, not chaste. And there I remember the suffragettes with their chastity, votes for women and chastity for men. She doesn't think that fucklessness by definition equals being an alien, and it doesn't equal being unfree. And here Dworkin cites what she calls the rebel virginity of Joan of Arc, whose refusal to be fucked over, was not prudery or weakness, but harmonious, she says, with the deepest values of resistance to any political despotism. Joan refused sexual accessibility to men in the same gesture as she refused civil insignificance. Her rejection of sex, of being open to men, accessible to men, was a refusal to accept a particular status, the status of civil insignificance. She says Dworkin says it was a rejection of the social meaning of being female in its entirety. Her virginity was Joan's virginity was a radical renunciation of a civil worthlessness rooted in real sexual practice. Dworkin's analysis of the fuck as a social and political institution, not simply a set of or a group of individual acts, enables us to see how resistance to the fuck in our world might be a political gesture of great power, at least in some circumstances. Rather than a cowering from freedom or fear of sex, such a resistance can constitute a refusal in the very name of civil standing and significance, being someone at last, and of freedom. At the heart of Dworkin's feminism was a wild and extravagant optimism, I think, that subordination was not natural, it was not inevitable, and that it could come to an end through the intransigence of women like Joan and what she calls their crazy resistance, or certainly characterized as crazy resistance. And I think we can see Dworkin's feminism in Intercourse, for example, as a wager on that possibility that things can, that subordination can come to an end, that it isn't any natural part of the world. Her feminism was a wager on the possibility that that was the case. So at one stage, not in Intercourse, but in the course of an interview with someone else, she says, the boys are betting on our compliance, our ignorance, our fear. The boys are betting that their depiction of us as whores will beat us down and stop our hearts. The boys are betting that their penises and their fists and their knives and their fucks and their rapes will turn us into what they say we are, the compliant women of sex, the voracious cunts of pornography, the masochistic sluts who resist because we really want more. She says the boys are betting, but the boys are wrong. And I think just to end, she wants to think about, to put to us, what if the boys are wrong? What if there's something else that we can reach for and go for, and become who we become, something quite different from what we are. Dworkin's epigraph to Intercourse is taken from Yeats's tender poem to the 1916 Easter uprising in Ireland, which goes, and I hope people are familiar with this. He says, and she quotes, "All changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born." I think she's suggesting that we are that terrible beauty. So for Dworkin, feminism was a possibility of that terrible beauty in our lives, nothing less than that, nothing less than a world that could be transformed by the rising of its objects, us, women. And I managed to finish a little bit early today, so I'm happy to go for any questions, answer any questions.
I've got a question, Helen.
Yes, she does.
I think Dworkin wrote this book quite a long time ago now. And I think that there had been, maybe there even was at that time, some hope in feminism that sex could be changed and it actually could be something else, even between men and women. But now, of course, it seems much more brutal. We have all the strangulation and all the other terrible practices from pornography. I don't know. I mean, I'm amazed that, do you think she could write this today? Do you think she would have any hope, or that any of us can have any hope? Because it's so much worse. It is so much worse than I think we could ever have imagined.
I think there are signs, though. You know, every so often there are signs that make your ears prick up and your heart leap, and you sort of think, just maybe. And look, I might be naive, but I think Me Too was a little bit like that. That there was something going on there. It didn't, become what it could have become. That's true, but there was something there, and of people of women understanding how sex works in our society, and understanding that this isn't. When I first started teaching, and I did tend to use a little bit of Dworkin, but when I first started teaching, I would I was consciously always trying to counter this notion that sex was the private sphere, and all the kind of subordination happened outside of that, and that people then went back to their homes and they got into bed with somebody, and then that was like what do you call it? And what Christopher Lash called it, the heart of a heartless world, the refuge. That sex was kind of where we retreated, sex and love, and not part of the battlefield. And I think there is a sense in which we do understand a little bit more now what the battlefield is, and how the battlefield is in our hearts, and how the battlefield is in our bedrooms, in our homes, and in our intimate relations. And I think that there's a light dawning about that somehow. But I think the thing that would transform Me Too, and I think the thing that would have transformed Me Too, is if we had started to join the dots that we talked about. We talked about prostitution, and we talked about pornography, and we talked about sadomasochism, kink as well, what's called kink. Sorry, that's not my term, obviously. That we just didn't join that up. And even now, if I could just use an anecdote from my own experience, Simone Simone and I recently wrote a submission to the government's inquiry into consent, and we said until you address the consent in prostitution, you're simply missing the whole point, and you're leaving behind women who leaving behind this a whole set of women who don't, you're just abandoning them. And when you abandon women like that, and you abandon these arenas of struggle and killing and violence and so forth, the killing fields of the home, in the home, then you're never going to get anywhere. And so our proposal was that you could never, that one of the things that would invalidate consent would be if it was bought, so that you could never use as a defense in a rape case the fact that you had paid for something. And I think that would transform these questions. There are some specific things that we can do, but we can also start to join the dots. That's what I think. And maybe we'll still fail. It's possible, but we'll have failed by trying, not by failure, not by lack of courage. I think in the story of Joan of Arc, there's that sense of courage as something that really we need a lot more of. And that's why I think that notion of, she's not calling women, she's not saying women are to blame for their own victimization. She's just asking us let's be more courageous, and not just one by one, but the whole lot of us together. That's what I think. So I'm more hopeful. I'm more hopeful than you are, Sheila. A little bit, sometimes, but not always, though. Of course.
There's there's quite a few questions in the chat, and so one of them is, why did she spend her life with Stoltenberg, or much of her life? Given we've got 7 minutes,
it's incomprehensible. I suppose, I don't know, but it just seemed to never. He just never seemed to add anything to the thing. I was reading when she first met him, he passed out drunk, and then he woke up and he said, I decided that I would always be with her. And I'm kind of, well, very lucky for you, but I don't. And that sort of taking over of her bequest to us, I think is insidious. So I don't know. Maybe it just gets lonely. Do you think?
There's another question here saying, why can you explain why Dworkin persisted in believing in the humanity of men?
I don't know. I guess this is something that we were talking about before we began, and we were talking about how all of us have tried to make excuses for men who are close to us. And I'm not immune to that at all. I had a father who, if anything, was, more feminist than his daughters were when they were young, when the daughters were young, and he would always, there was never any sense that we couldn't do what anybody else could do. I have a son, and who's really just an amazing person, I suppose. And maybe I'm just trying to think on my feet here, but that I sort of feel there must be a way to save those few. But I understand that seems naive, and we're talking about that phrase, not my Nigel, and that's true as well. But sometimes we feel that there are some worthy ones out there, I suppose. So it's few. That's the problem. Thanks, Deborah. Yeah, exactly. But it must be like, the what is it when God says to the people from Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah, and says, you know, if you can find a righteous person there, I'll save the whole city. And then they can't of course find them. I know we are human, and so are they. And somebody just said, but at the same time, sometimes they act so badly that you really doubt that, and you really kind of wonder about, you know, just how kind do we have to be to them, you know? And this latest assault, you know, where we have to be kind to them when they decide they are us. I mean, it's the worst of all. You know, it's that kind of, this is the final stage in our possession, that they're now coming, that they now want to be us, to turn us inside out, and to become women, because they do it better than we do. I know that sounds a little bit pessimistic, but
I've got a final question, or that, and I think I can't see any other in the chat, but could you say a bit about how women are individuals, and that we are individuals, and then also it affects us how women are perceived, or what happens to other women, how much, but in relation to Dworkin, how, I mean, it seems, yeah, how much we're related to the whole thing of all women.
Can I relate this to what we were talking about just before we came on again? In Australia, a young woman was just killed, fairly common, you know, that's a fairly common occurrence everywhere. She was 21 and she was killed by this fellow who was 24. They were teachers at the same school, and she was killed because she had gone out with him for about 6 weeks, I think, and then he had more than usual brutality to kill her, and then he killed himself. And when the police superintendent spoke about this, he said, he told us, the rest of us, not to worry, or he tried to reassure us, which is what they do, you know, that's what they do. But he tried to reassure us by telling us and calming us, reassuring us that this was an isolated incident. And what he was doing there, I think, you know, in his, I mean, I'm not blaming him completely, but he just kind of completely misunderstood what was going on here, which was saying, this is an isolated incident. This happened to one individual woman. She was killed because she had left this man and he couldn't stand it. But she was killed because she was a woman. He was sad, he was angry, he was whatever he was because she had left him, but he killed her because she was a woman. Even women don't always recognize that. We don't, if something happens, as I was saying, if something happens to somebody on racial or ethnic grounds, a Jew or a black person or somebody, and another Jew or another black person is killed or wounded in that way, they know that it's done to them because they are black, because they are Jewish. Women don't have that sense that what is being done to us is because we are women. We have a sense that what is being done to us is because of a certain pattern of individual things that have happened. So we fell out, you know, we fell out of love, we left them, he was, all this sort of thing. In this case, this woman was killed because she was a woman. We are treated as we are because we are women, not because I am Helen Pringle and I have certain relations and so forth. I am treated as a woman, what happens to me. And to recognize that, and to recognize the full extent of that, is to really take responsibility and to see things take responsibility for the world, and to see things in a very different way, to see myself in a different way as a woman. And it can be hard to do that. I know for myself, it took a long time before I could understand myself as part of the things called women. I'm not being stupid here. I knew I was a woman, you know, but I didn't understand what happened to me, how I was treated, how I was, and how I treated myself had to do with my womanhood in that way. And I think we really need to do more of that understanding of how we are related to other women. And one of the ways that we can do that is through cultivation of friendship with other women. Again, for a long time, my best friends were always men, you know, and I had very few friends who were women, or good friends who were women. And I sort of took a little bit of pride in that, I think, but not understanding how I was a woman and connected to these other objects called women and what we had in common. And I think when you start to understand that and start to throw your lot in with other women, then a new world does start to take shape, I think.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much.
We love women.
Yeah. That was brilliant. Lovely, brilliant webinar. And see everybody next week, hopefully, for Catherine McKinnon, Feminism Unmodified, that we're going to have with Sheila Jeffries and Cara Dempsey. But thank you for that.
Thank you for having me again.
Okay. Bye, Helen.
Bye.